Well, thank you so much for such a lovely welcome, and thank you for coming out this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, and so exciting to hear what's going on in Gloucestershire. It's a real revolution happening here, and I'm really excited to be with you and to plan the next steps as we go forward. So I was asked to say something about the state of the nation, actually. So I hope you've got about 5 or 6 hours, because it might take that long. But no, I was going to just sort of reflect maybe just even on the last few weeks in Parliament. That would take us long enough, probably, because it's been just such a bizarre last few weeks. And just to sort of think a little bit about what kind of a government we have right now before going on to talk about the kind of government we desperately need. And in a way, I think, I was trying to think what a theme would be in this speech. And maybe it's about making connections. And actually, that takes me full circle right back to what got me involved in the Green Party in the first place, because it is a huge honour and privilege, as it always is, to share a platform, as I shall be a little bit later, with Jonathan Porritt. And it was his book, Seeing Green, that I was just reflecting was published in 1984. That's nearly 40 years ago. That is so scary. And what's even more scary is that if you read that book today, as I warmly recommend that you do, it is every bit as topical and every bit as urgent now, even more urgent than it was 40 years ago. But I read that book, and what I loved about it was the way in which it made connections between all the different things that I was interested in at the time. So I was interested in women's groups. I was taking part with CND in anti-nuclear movement. I was deeply concerned about the environment, but it felt like I was being pulled in 10 different directions at once. And then what the beauty was of this book, and is of this book, is that it makes the connections between our relationships with each other, our relationships with the planet, and the kind of underlying causes which underpin all of those issues. So it wasn't just dealing with symptoms, it was dealing with causes. And it was all about making connections. And it feels to me, if I'm thinking about this government over the last few years and more, is that it feels to be a government that is totally incapable of making any connections at all. It cannot actually have a joined up narrative about the kinds of challenges our country faces, and therefore the kind of solutions that we need to address it. It's been summed up in so many ways. For example, not being able to see the connection between trying to reduce air pollution and the impact that might have on reducing waiting lists for the NHS, or the kind of thing we've seen yesterday in the autumn statement, where we saw a government that was taking money out of public services and instead of actually investing in those public services that we desperately need to get people back to work. If we're serious about getting people back to work, stop sanctioning them and start giving them the health support and the other support that they need to enable them to go back to work. So this is a government that is totally incapable, it seems to me, of making connections. And right now, I think more than ever, we need a government with vision and leadership, instead of which we have Rishi Sunak, a populist prime minister presiding over a government that is totally bankrupt in terms of vision and ambition and ideas, totally failing to rise to this moment. And as I say, I was going to reflect just on 3 things that have happened recently. First of all, the green light that the government gave to the Rosebank oil field, and then I was going to say a little bit about the King's speech, and then just to reflect about the autumn statement that was just a couple of days ago. But starting with the decision on Rosebank, it was so cynical, first of all. Rosebank, just for those people that haven't been following this, is the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. If it goes ahead, and it looks like it will, then it will produce the same amount of emissions on an annual basis as the 28 poorest countries put together. This is a vast oil field. And I think it's important to recognize right from the start that any argument that this government comes up with to suggest that we somehow need this oil field for our own energy security absolutely needs to be shot down straight away, because the vast majority of the oil from Rosebank will be for export. So it'll do absolutely nothing for our energy bills, energy prices, or energy security. What it will also do is give a huge windfall profit, in a way, a windfall amount of money to Equinor, the Norwegian oil company that is likely to be the one that is exploiting this particular oil field, because the government has such a generous set of subsidies that it's giving to those companies that extract oil. So we're actually paying a Norwegian company to come in and drive climate emissions for absolutely no benefit for us at all. I mean, to do that at any time would be the definition of absurdity. To be doing it during a cost of living crisis, I think, is just the most reckless thing you could imagine. So this Rosebank decision has been something that we've been expecting for a while, but of course, guess when the government decided to give the green light to it? It was when Parliament was away on its conference recess, so there could be absolutely no scrutiny of it, no challenge to it, and no way of really holding the government to account for doing this. And when you look at all of the science that is telling us that absolutely there is already more coal and oil and gas in existing developments that can be safely burned if we're to have a livable future, if there's already more oil and gas that we already know about and are already exploiting, vast amounts more than we can safely burn if we're to stay below 1.5 degrees of global heating, then to be going around trying to extract even more is just so reckless. And the government's own advisors, the Climate Change Committee, has confirmed once and for all that that is the case. They said very clearly in their advice to Parliament that while the UK will need some oil and gas until it reaches net zero, they said very, very clearly, and I quote, "This does not in itself justify the development of new North Sea fields." And then you've got all kinds of international scientists saying the same thing and really warning that, you know, once Britain did have quite a good story to tell about climate change on the global stage, and other countries are noticing this. They are noticing when we give a green light to a new coal field in Cumbria. They notice when we're giving a green light to 100 new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea, and they certainly notice when we give the green light to the Rosebank oil field. So not only is this so reckless and bad in its own terms, but it also sends out a message to all other countries that actually, if the UK, the sixth largest economy in the world, isn't actually serious about this agenda, then why should they be either? So in a sense, as I say, one could try to think about why would the government be doing this. And I think it does come back to the fact that they are a populist, divisive government that basically want to reap division. They want to try to score some points over Labour. And in a sense, they've succeeded in that, because Labour, for all that it said that it won't give the green light to new oil and gas fields, they have said categorically that they won't try to reverse decisions that have been taken by this government about the oil and gas fields that might be being given a green light right now. And the unforgivableness of that position is on Rosebank, for example, which was only given the green light a couple of months ago. If the Labour Party had said loudly and clearly at that point that were they to become the next government, they would reverse this decision, then that would have given, I think, Equinor sufficiently cold feet to mean they would not have gone ahead with that investment. So Labour could have made a difference on this, and they haven't. And I think this is, yet another bit of that kind of Tory goading of Labour to try to see whether or not they will dare to challenge them. And on this, sadly, they have not. And again, what is so unforgivable is that the real solutions to energy security, if that's what the government were genuinely serious about, would be, for example, the investment in the mass local authority-led, street-by-street home insulation programme, home retrofit programme, which we know is the fastest, cheapest, most effective way of getting people's emissions down too. Not only that, but it would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. It would get people's fuel bills down, get emissions down, save the NHS money by keeping us all warmer and healthier. Those are all of those connections that I was talking about a second ago. And yet, you'll perhaps remember, if you reflect on the autumn statement of yesterday, there was not a single word about energy efficiency or about keeping people's homes warm. So for all of this rhetoric about actually caring about people, the thing that could have made the biggest difference in terms of people's fuel bills, in terms of people's health, would have been this home insulation programme, and that was nowhere on the government's agenda at all. We also know that programmes like that, like home insulation and so forth, are massively backed by citizens' assemblies, those assemblies of people that come together, a genuine cross-section of society, and are given time to deliberate over what kinds of policies might be the appropriate ones to deal with a challenge of the size and scale of the climate challenge. And time and again, those citizens' assemblies come up with policies that are far bolder, far more ambitious than any government comes up with. And certainly they are usually in the forefront of proposing measures like keeping homes warm as a first step. And as I say, it was not just Rosebank, so let's just move on for a second to the King's speech, because, again, that King's speech was totally lacking in vision, totally lacking in any kind of narrative. It was basically a menu of different kinds of issues which the government was hoping to fight these culture wars on with Labour. And so for that reason, they have manufactured a bill that really is not necessary at all. This is the Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill. And basically, this is a cheap and divisive gimmick designed to give them a bit of rhetoric in order to try to prop up both the Prime Minister's own popularity in the polls and also propping up a dying oil and gas industry. But essentially what this bill does is simply to formalise the idea of having annual applications by oil companies for new fossil fuel production. But we already had those annual application rounds. We had them in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. Admittedly, we didn't have it in 2020 because there was a particular issue around a so-called climate checkpoint that I won't get into. But essentially, these annual rounds were already happening. And they will sadly go on happening for as long as we have on our statute book what I think is perhaps one of the most, I'm going to use the word evil, wicked, awful, perverse, terrible laws on our statute book, which basically says that we have a legal duty to, and I quote, maximize the economic recovery of petroleum from the North Sea. I mean, how many people know that we actually have this duty? It's called the MER duty, M-E-R, maximize the economic return of North Sea oil and gas. And that is a legal duty on the statute book, which I have been trying for many years to delete in a number of amendments to legislation without success. So already we were having these annual rounds. Already we had this duty to maximize the economic recovery of oil and gas. So the purpose of this bill was absolutely nothing more than performative politics. It really was not necessary in any shape or form. But of course, the government did it because it was another way of fighting a battle on oil and gas, and it thinks that it can win some points off Labour by doing that. Frankly, I'm not even sure that it can. I think a lot of people recognise that we do need to shift towards a different way forward if we're serious about the size and the scale of the climate crisis, and that locking ourselves into yet more costly fossil fuels is probably the absolute worst thing we could be doing. And the economics tells its own story. Already, renewables are so much cheaper than fossil fuels. So why on earth would any government think that a rational thing to do when you've got a cost of living crisis, when you've got an energy affordability crisis, why would you then lock us into the most expensive way of producing our oil and gas? Words kind of fail me, really. There's a wonderful man, Fatih Birol, who's head of the International Energy Agency. He put it very, very clearly just a few weeks ago when he said that those who are expanding oil and gas production could, in his words, which I think have a little dose of understatement, they could be taking very unhealthy, unwise economic and climate risks. Yes, they are definitely doing that. They are also probably ending up with so-called stranded assets. In other words, companies are investing in more and more oil and gas, which they might never be able to actually bring to shore, because hopefully by that time we will have governments in place who will be recognizing the seriousness of the climate crisis and recognizing that we will never be able to burn this stuff in the first place. Fatih Birol suggests that globally, the amount of money that might end up in these so-called stranded assets could exceed $1 trillion globally. So that is a major problem. The King's speech, other than that bit of performative politics around the petroleum bill, was just so bankrupt in terms of the kinds of ideas that we really need to help people right now. So many people were hoping that there would actually be something on stopping forced evictions from housing. You know, that there was a bill that the government had been promising for years, the Renters Reform Bill, which would make a big difference to people who are struggling to pay their rents and certainly struggling ever to save enough money to be able to buy a house. And we know that so much homelessness is happening right now because when tenants try to raise problems with their landlords around, let's say, leaky cold, damp properties that aren't properly being maintained, then at the moment, landlords have the right, essentially, to have so-called no-fault evictions, and people are evicted if they are troublesome in their view. And so the government's been promising for a very long time that we would have no-fault evictions banned. They promised it under the last Queen's speech, as it was then, and in this King's speech, the Renters Reform Bill has come back, but that bit, the key bit, about trying to make sure that we ban no-fault evictions is still put on the back burner. It's still being said that we'll get to that at some point, but it's certainly not going to be there anytime soon. So there was nothing in the King's speech really to address the massive housing crisis, which is certainly one of the biggest issues in Brighton and Hove. I don't know how much of an issue it is here, but so many young people, for them, any idea of being able to get a foot on the housing ladder is a distant, distant dream. There was nothing really in terms of the home insulation programme that I was talking about, and nothing that I think is really going to improve people's lives. And then yesterday we had the autumn statement, and it just feels like we go from bad to worse, really. It was a smug and short-term statement from a chancellor who, it feels to me, feels like he's on a totally different planet from the vast majority of us who are living on this one. Because sitting through that statement yesterday and seeing the Tories wave their agenda papers, their order papers, and seeing and hearing all of the rhetoric about how we've turned this corner and how the economy is doing really well, it just felt like a parallel universe, because that is not the experience of most people right now, I think, in this country. And it's certainly not the experience that's borne out if you look at some of the figures, because we know that we still have the highest inflation in the G7. We know that the cost of living crisis is still digging in. And what did the government do? It chose to give the impression of tax cuts via this reduction in national insurance. But you will know from the analysis that's been happening over the last 24 hours that because of the freezing of the thresholds, which is where you start being dragged into paying tax, that is not even a genuine tax cut anyway, because you're going to end up paying more in tax because of the freezing of the thresholds. And not even that, but the extent to which some money is being found to make that cut in national insurance, that is being found by taking money out of public services. I mean, you really couldn't make it up. We know, every poll tells us, that the vast majority of people would rather see money invested in our crumbling public services, NHS and education in particular, rather than 1p off or whatever it is, 2p off national insurance. We need investment into our public services if we are ever to have prosperity in this country. And to see a chancellor who is taking that money out simply for a few headlines in the right-wing press, I think is deeply, deeply depressing. And also, what wasn't in that autumn statement, which I think should be on the agenda, is wealth taxes. Why is there such a taboo about talking about wealth taxes? Why is there not more of a recognition that in this country there is such a huge gulf between the rate at which we tax income and the rate at which we tax wealth? So if you look at the last 10 years, we've been taxing income on average at about 32%, and we've been taxing wealth at about 4%. That is just outrageous. There is money in this country. The question is, who has it? And frankly, how do we get hold of it? There was an interesting article in The Guardian just the other day that was saying that the richest 250 families in the UK are sitting on a combined wealth of £748 billion. We could do with a bit of that. It could make a real difference. And yet, again, we don't seem to have a real opposition in the country that will put that on the agenda. No one is going anywhere near it. I was on the politics programme on the morning of the autumn statement and challenged Labour on this, and they don't want to talk about it. They are so afraid of being painted into the corner of somehow being these radical people. Well, countries like Switzerland and Norway and Spain, which are not particularly known as being, hives of communist radicalism, have had wealth taxes for a very long time. And if we're serious about the investment that we need in our country, then we should have those kinds of taxes too. And I want to just give out a shout out to a wonderful group called the Patriotic Millionaires, who are actually what they say on the tin. They have been really working hard to lobby government to say, come on, we are up for this. We want a fairer society. We recognise it's in everybody's interests. And all of the analysis from Kate Pickett and the Spirit Level, a book that was written easily 10 years ago now, I can't remember how long ago it was, but all of the evidence, academically speaking, is that fairer, more equal societies are good for everyone in society, not just those people who are on the lower incomes, but actually people on the higher incomes are better off in fairer economies. And yet that debate, even having the debate about wealth taxes, is off the agenda. Instead, what we had from the government, of course, was what I would call performative cruelty of even tougher work capability assessments. This is the argument, and of course it's the argument that the government always uses because it loves to divide and rule. So it needs to have somebody to divide against and someone to channel people's anger against. And if it's not immigrants, which it usually is, then it's definitely people who are not working. And so we're now treated to the prospect that there are supposed to be millions of people who are, so well off on benefits that they're not bothering to work. We know that if it was the case that you would be better off on benefits than working, it certainly hasn't been the case for a very, very long time. We also know that many of the people who are not in work right now are not in work because of mental health problems, because of physical health problems, because of the 7 million people who are waiting for appointments in the NHS, and all of that. And what we have from the government is a suggestion that if you've not been sufficiently active in looking for work over a 6-month period, then your case, as they call it, will be closed. Not only that, so you'll be destitute, and presumably anybody dependent upon you will similarly be destitute. But not only that, but things like your free NHS prescriptions will be cancelled. How can that help anybody? In what universe could it make sense to say that people that are clearly already struggling for whatever reason would be better off if we stop them from having free NHS prescriptions? It is just, as I say, performative cruelty. So this is the bad news. And I appreciate I've spent some time talking about the bad news. But I am here as well to tell you that there is plenty of good news. And you've heard some of it already about the way in which the Green Party is growing from strength to strength. We've already heard about the success in Gloucestershire, but across the country, the Green Party of England and Wales is doing extraordinarily well. 750 councillors now on 10 councils. We are the largest party. We're in coalitions on around 35. There is a real upswell of people who are voting Green because they recognise that when they do that, they get really hard-working councillors and they get a more positive agenda. They get people who really listen to them and work really hard on their behalf. And so when I was talking just now about what was in the King's Speech, I just wanted to quickly run through some of the policies that I thought should have been in the King's Speech, that would have been in the King's Speech had we had a Green government, and they were part of the kind of lobbying and campaigning that my office had been doing in the run-up to that speech. So the first thing was a Clean Air Human Rights Bill, also known as Ella's Law. And some of you might remember that Ellie Kissy Deborah was a 9-year-old girl in London who tragically died from air pollution and was the first person ever to have air pollution put on their death certificate as a cause of their death. She lived very close to extremely busy roads in London and died from air pollution. So it's known as Ella's Law, and it would absolutely enshrine a new human right to clean air in UK law and would require that to be achieved in England within 5 years. And again, if we're talking about the kind of joined-up thinking between the impact on the health service, the impact on young people, the impact on the environment, it's a win-win from all of those perspectives. A renters' reform bill worthy of the name. I've mentioned how I thought that the Section 21 forced evictions ban should be a central part of that. Frankly, I still think it's a bit perverse that we sell off our council housing without building affordable housing in its place. And it's even more perverse when you learn that 40% of the council homes that we sell off are actually sold to the private sector. So we are simply still keeping people as tenants, but they are paying money to the private sector rather than paying into the council house sector, which could at least then get recycled by local authorities. So we need to build more affordable homes. We need to have a ban on Section 1 evictions, 2021 evictions. And I think we also need to have rent controls to be brought in those places where rents are spiraling out of control. And again, in countries like Germany, they've done this for a great many years. At the very least, we could have rules that rents shouldn't be increasing higher than inflation, let's say. And then over time, you could imagine a way of ratcheting that down, and the New Economics Foundation has done some really good work on that. And then, when it comes to fossil fuels, I was proposing a just fossil fuel phase-out bill, which is quite hard to say. But the reason for it being a just fossil fuel phase-out bill is because we recognise that many people's jobs are dependent on fossil fuels right now. So we do need to have a so-called just transition. We do need to make sure that workers in the oil and gas industry are retrained, are paid equivalently, and are given the support to transition into green energy and not just left, as so many people were left in the coal industries when the coal mines were closed down. So we need a just transition, but we also need absolutely to phase out fossil fuels. You'll know that the big COP meeting, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, we're meeting in the UAE, actually starting next week. And one of the big battles then is going to be about whether or not the language talks about phasing out fossil fuels or phasing down fossil fuels. We had the minister come to give evidence to us in the Environmental Audit Select Committee, of which I'm a member, just a few weeks ago, and I was not reassured when he basically said, phase out, phase down, doesn't really matter, does it? And we were saying, yes, it does, quite a lot. So we absolutely need that to be a phase out, and we need to give support as well to some really exciting initiatives coming from the Global South. So there is also an initiative called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So you'll know about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been a long-standing treaty which tries to ensure that more countries don't try to acquire nuclear weapons, and we could have a big discussion about how successful it's been, but I would wager that it's been more successful than not having such a thing. And now there are a number of countries in the Global South who are proposing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, by which they mean some global architecture through which those countries who are still needing energy would have the support to be able to transition to greener energy forms, while those of us who have been using fossil fuels for a very long time would be properly guaranteeing both to phase those out and to give some finance to those poorer countries. But there are some really interesting proposals coming from the South on that, and I think it's something to really look out for from the COP discussions next week. Two more, very quickly. A Green New Deal bill to pave the way for a massive programme of public-led investment in green projects like renewable energy, the green home upgrades, the nature-friendly farming. I've not mentioned much about land use yet tonight, but actually we know that we need very radical changes to land use if we're going to be serious about meeting our climate change objectives. And perhaps related to that, the final bill that I was pressing for was an English right to roam bill. In Scotland, they've had such a bill for a very long time. We've tried to introduce a bill here, and there was a bill in 2000, which was the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. But in England and Wales, that actually just gave people the right to access 8% of land and 3% of rivers, which is not great. So I just feel there is so much potential, really, if we could ensure that more people had more access to land. And of course, there need to be rules around that. And of course, responsibilities goes with rights. And of course, there would be lots of discussions that need to be had with landowners, just as there were in Scotland when they introduced this policy over 20 years ago. And it's worked very, very well in Scotland. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it is that I really believe that that our intimacy with nature and our experience of nature is a really important thing in its own right. But I think it's also a real mobilizer when it comes to giving people the tools that they might need in order to be able to fight to protect nature. And I was really struck by a book by Richard Louv called Last Child in the Woods. And in that book, he's a US writer, he says we won't protect what we don't love, and we won't love what we don't know, and we won't know what we don't feel and touch and smell and taste. And that just really rang a bell to me, particularly when you put that alongside the information that we also know, which is increasingly young children are finding it harder to identify some basic things like conkers or bluebells or blackberries, and it sort of reached its its climax of concern when the Collins Dictionary, Junior Dictionary, proposed taking out all of those sorts of words like conker and bluebell and substituting them with chat room and bot. And there was a very strong backlash, which fortunately succeeded. But it feels to me that giving young people that access to nature and knowing nature in that way is so important. So that's one of the reasons that I feel passionately about an English Right to Roam bill. And so I'm going to wind up. The Green Party has loads of common sense ideas, big ideas, but common sense ideas, and they are increasingly popular. And if I'm looking just here in Gloucestershire, 37 councillors, I think, in total across the county, are delivering everything from free travel for veterans. I think in Gloucester, £450,000 worth of funding for retrofit skilled and a green energy training centre, which will open to its first students in early 24 in Stroud. Standing up for wildlife, opposing big new roads that are going to go through the Forest of Dean. And our big vision of a fairer, greener country is absolutely rooted in economic, social, environmental, and democratic change, because, to come full circle, we know all of these things are connected, and we know the importance of connecting two people to what matters to them. We've got some very exciting plans for the general election, which I hope someone might ask me about. Maybe I can plant an idea in Jonathan's mind so we can talk a bit about the general election. In Brighton Pavilion, Sian Berry, native of this very town, is standing to be the new Green MP in Brighton Pavilion. So if you can give her any support, that'd be fantastic. But you'll also know we have Carla Denyer in Bristol, Adrian Ramsey in Waveney Valley, Ellie Chowns in North Herefordshire. We're really going all out for them, as well as Daniel and all of your lovely, lovely councillors here. So, you know, people often say, you know, what difference can we make? And I appreciate, you know, I have spent quite a bit of time painting a picture that is a bit bleak, but we can all make a difference. And one of the ways we can do it, just one way, but one way, is about the way we choose to cast our votes. So if any of you out there isn't yet voting Green, can I warmly commend that you might do so? Thank you.